The stone floor was cold against her. Skin each breath became a conscious effort weighted by the wooden boards, pressing down, crushing her. Slowly Margaret Cleo knew this would be her final moments, not in quiet surrender, but in absolute defiance in the narrow streets of York were Tudor England's. Religious tensions simmered like a volatile brew. Margaret was more than just another Catholic woman. She was a secret keeper, a resistance fighter, her faith burning brighter than the dangers that surrounded her. The year was 1586, and in Elizabeth's Protestant kingdom, being Catholic was not just a religious choice, it was a death sentence. Imagine a world where your deepest beliefs could condemn you, where sheltering a priest could mean the difference between martyrdom and survival. Margaret lived in that razor's edge, knowing each whispered prayer, each hidden sacred text could unravel everything she wasn't born into. Rebellion, once a typical merchant's wife, Margaret had transformed into something far more dangerous, a woman who understood that true conviction transcends personal safety. Her small wooden house in York became a sanctuary, a hidden network for Catholic priests, hunted like animals through England's increasingly hostile landscape. The Protestant authorities knew her type: women who refused to be silent, who turned domestic spaces into battlegrounds of faith. They called her a recusant, a term that meant more than religious nonconformity. It meant active resistance. While other women might have cowed, Margaret stood firm, or quiet determination more powerful than any weapon. Her choice was stark: renounce her faith or face the consequences. And Margaret Cleo was not a woman who would bend. The evidence against her was damning. Priests hidden in her home, secret masses conducted in whispers, forbidden religious texts carefully concealed. Each piece of evidence was a thread in a tapestry of religious defiance that would ultimately lead her to this moment, pressed between wooden boards, her body becoming a testament to her unbreakable spirit. This wasn't just an execution, this was a message, a warning to anyone who dared challenge the religious orthodoxy of Elizabeth in England. But in trying to silence her, they would ensure that Margaret Cleo would never be forgotten. Her story is more than a historical record. It's a profound meditation on courage, on what happens when personal conviction collides with institutional power in a world designed to crush dissent. Margaret chose to stand unbowed, her silence more eloquent than 1,000 spoken protests. As the wooden boards descended, as the weights were added methodically, Margaret Cleo represented something larger than herself. She was the embodiment of resistance, a woman who transformed a brutal execution into an act of profound spiritual rebellion. This is her story, a story of faith, of extraordinary courage, and of a woman who would rather die than compromise her deepest beliefs in the gray stone streets of Tudor England. Religious belief was no longer a private matter of conscience, but a dangerous political weapon. The reign of Elizabeth had transformed faith into a battleground where every whispered prayer could mean the difference between life and death. Since Elizabeth's coronation in 1558, England had been cleaved into two irreconcilable worlds: the official Protestant state and the underground Catholic resistance. The queen, daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, had systematically dismantled the Catholic Church's power, declaring herself supreme governor of the Church of England. Her religious settlement wasn't just a theological shift, it was a calculated political strategy to stabilize a kingdom fractured by decades of religious warfare. Catholics found themselves trapped in a legal nightmare. Practicing their faith became an act of treason. Priests who said Mass could be executed as traitors. Lay Catholics faced increasingly brutal penalties, fines that could strip entire families of their wealth, imprisonment, and potential execution. The law was clear and merciless: conform, suffer. Many Catholic Families responded by creating intricate networks of secret worship they built. Hidden chapels in their homes developed. Coded languages and shelter traveling. Priests who risked everything to maintain spiritual connections. These weren't just religious practices, they were acts of profound spiritual resistance. Elizabeth's government responded with a complex surveillance. State informants were everywhere, motivated by financial rewards and political favor. Neighbors watched. Neighbors' families were divided, and trust became a rare commodity. The government's network of spies and provocators meant that no Catholic could ever feel truly safe. The theological differences weren't merely abstract. Theological debates, they represented fundamentally different views of human authority and divine right. Catholics believed in the Pope's supreme spiritual authority, while Elizabeth and Protestants saw the monarch as the head of the Church. Each perspective carried profound political implications in an era where religion and governance were inseparable. This wasn't a bloodless conflict between 1558 and 1580. Over 200 Catholics were executed for their faith. These weren't just statistics, they were fathers, mothers, sons, and daughters who chose spiritual conviction over personal safety. Their executions were public, gruesome spectacles designed to terrorize potential religious dissenters. For Catholics like Margaret Clitheroe, this wasn't a distant political struggle. It was a daily reality of survival, of maintaining spiritual integrity in a world designed to crush their beliefs. Every mass attended in secret, every priest sheltered, every prayer whispered, was an act of extraordinary courage. The religious landscape of Elizabeth and England wasn't just a conflict between Protestants and Catholics, it was a complex terrain of survival where individual conscience collided with state power and where personal faith could mean the difference between life and death. In this world of shadows and secrets, Margaret Clitheroe would emerge as a remarkable testament to spiritual resistance, a woman who would ultimately pay the ultimate price for her unwavering belief in the shadowed corners of York's narrow streets. Margaret Clio lived a life balanced between absolute devotion and mortal danger. The year was 1577, and Elizabeth's Protestant England was a landscape of religious terror where Catholic faith could mean death. Margaret was not born into rebellion, she was transformed by it. Married to John Clio, a Protestant carpenter, she had once lived a conventional life, but something fundamental shifted when she converted to Catholicism, a choice that would remake her entire existence in a world where religious allegiance was tracked with the precision of a hunter following prey. Margaret chose a path of extraordinary risk. Her home became a sanctuary, a delicate, dangerous machine of resistance. Behind closed doors, she sheltered Catholic priests who moved like ghosts through the city, moving between hidden chambers and secret rooms. These priests were not merely religious figures, they were hunted men with prices on their heads, carrying the forbidden sacraments of a faith-driven underground. Margaret understood the mathematics of her choice. Harboring a priest could mean death. Practicing Catholic rituals in secret could mean torture, yet she did not waver. She transformed her house into a complex network of hidden spaces, concealed rooms where priests could celebrate Mass, store sacred vessels, change into liturgical vestments. Imagine the precision required. A single mistake, a whispered word, overheard, a glimpse through a window, a servant's inadvertent revelation could unravel everything. Her children were trained in absolute discretion, learning to move silently, to speak carefully, to protect the sacred secret that lived within their walls. Her faith was not passive resistance, but active defiance. She arranged for her sons to be educated in Catholic seminaries abroad, ensuring the continuation of a faith that the state was desperately trying to extinguish. Each journey, each arrangement was a Calculated risk, a move in a dangerous political chess game where the stakes were life and death. Margaret knew the risks. Intimately, Protestant authorities were ruthless in their hunt for Catholic sympathizers. Priests were tortured, executed in grotesque public spectacles designed to terrify and discourage. Families were torn apart, properties confiscated, lives destroyed, yet she did not retreat. Her courage was not reckless, but deeply considered. She understood that her actions were not merely personal religious choices, but part of a larger spiritual resistance. Each hidden mass, each priest sheltered, was an act of profound political and spiritual rebellion against a state that sought to control not just actions, but beliefs. In the intricate dance of survival and faith, Margaret moved with a grace that was both political strategy and spiritual conviction. Her home was not just a physical space, but a living testament, a quiet, persistent challenge to a system that sought to crush her beliefs. This was Margaret Clitheroe, not a martyr in waiting, but a woman who transformed her daily existence into an act of resistance, who understood that true faith sometimes requires extraordinary courage. The chambers were still that winter morning in 1586, the silence broken only by the methodical scraping of boots against stone. Margaret Clio knew they were coming. For years she had hidden Catholic priests transforming her home into a sanctuary. When practicing her faith meant risking everything, the local authorities had been watching her, not just watching. Hunting in England, where Catholic worship was now considered treason. Margaret's quiet defiance was a flame waiting to be extinguished. Her husband, John, a Protestant who surprisingly tolerated her secret practices, was not home when the search began. They came with warrants and a cold, calculated precision. Every floorboard, every hidden compartment would be examined. Margaret stood resolute, her hand steady, her gaze unflinching. She knew the consequences of harboring priests, men who represented a faith now criminalized by Queen Elizabeth's government. Catholic priests were not merely religious figures, they were political enemies, seen as potential agents of foreign powers, conduits for potential rebellion against the Protestant state. Each priest Margaret sheltered was an act of profound personal and political rebellion. The searchers found what they sought: a hidden priest vestments, sacred texts, evidence of Catholic worship. These were not just religious objects, they were treasonous artifacts in the eyes of the law. Margaret did not plead, did not beg. Her silence was its own form of resistance. Her arrest was swift and methodical. The charges were clear: harboring Catholic priests, maintaining illegal religious practices, and undermining the religious authority of the Protestant state. In Elizabeth and England, these were not minor infractions, but fundamental challenges to the sovereign's authority. The implications were devastating. Hiding a priest could mean death, not just imprisonment, but a deliberately cruel execution designed to terrorize other potential resistors. Margaret understood this. She had seen other Catholics punish their bodies, broken as warnings to those who might challenge the state's religious orthodoxy. What drove her, not mere stubbornness, but a profound spiritual conviction in a world where faith had become a dangerous political statement. Margaret saw her actions as a sacred duty. Each priest she protected was a lifeline to a spiritual tradition being systematically dismantled. Her arrest was more than a personal tragedy. It was a microcosm of the larger religious conflicts consuming England, a struggle between old faith and new order, between personal conviction and state power. Margaret was not just a woman facing charges, but a symbol of resistance against a system designed to crush dissent. As they led her away, Margaret carried with her the weight of her choices. She knew the path ahead would be brutal, but she also knew that her faith was something no legal decree, no royal command could truly extinguish. In that moment of arrest, she was already transforming from a woman into a potential martyr. The stone walls of the prison would soon become her crucible, her moment of ultimate testimony, and Margaret Cleo was prepared to bear witness no matter the cost. In the winter of 1586, Margaret Cleo stood silent, not from fear, but from a calculated defiance that would shake the foundations of her accuser's legal machinery. The courtroom in York was a theater of power where Protestant authorities sought to crush Catholic resistance through elaborate legal spectacles. Margaret knew every word she spoke could be twisted, every defense manipulated, so she chose silence. A silence so profound it became a weapon. The charges against her were meticulously crafted, harboring Catholic priests, allowing forbidden religious practices in her home, committing treason against Queen Elizabeth's religious decrees. Each accusation was a thread in a carefully woven net designed to trap not just Margaret, but the entire underground Catholic community. Her refusal to enter a plea was itself a radical act under English law. A defendant who would not plead could be subjected to peine forte, a dour pressing a punishment designed to force compliance. But Margaret understood something deeper by refusing to acknowledge the court's legitimacy. She transformed her trial from a legal proceeding into a moral statement. The judges were unprepared for such resistance. Their system relied on cooperation, on defendants playing their prescribed role. Margaret's silence was a mirror held up to their injustice, reflecting back the brutality of their own system. Her husband, John Clero, a Protestant who nonetheless supported her faith, watched helplessly their children, some still young, would soon face the consequences of her defiance. But Margaret's conviction ran deeper than personal safety. She believed her silence was a form of testimony, a way of witnessing her faith when speaking would mean certain death around her. The courtroom buzzed with tension. Protestant officials, accustomed to breaking dissent through intimidation, found themselves confronted by a woman who refused to be broken. Every moment of her silence was a sermon, every breath a challenge to their authority. The law was clear. Refusal to plea would be treated as a confession, and the punishment was predetermined, pressing. But Margaret saw this not as defeat, but as martyrdom. She understood that her silence would become louder than any speech, that her suffering would bear witness to a faith that could not be extinguished by legal decree. In those moments, Margaret was not just a woman on trial. She was a symbol of resistance, of a faith so profound that it could transform legal brutality into spiritual triumph. Her silence was a strategy, a protest, and ultimately a prophecy. The court would have its verdict, the law would have its punishment, but Margaret Cleo would ensure that history would remember not the verdict, but her unbreakable spirit. Her stillness in that courtroom was more thunderous than any plea, more powerful than any defense. She was writing a different kind of testimony, one that will be read not in legal documents, but in the hearts of those who would come after her. On a chilly March morning in 1586, the wooden door of York's toll booth creaked open. Margaret Cleo, a 33-year-old mother of three, stood before her executioners. She wore no chains, carried no defiance, only a quiet, unbreakable resolve that would transform a brutal punishment into an act of profound resistance. Pressing was not merely an execution, but a calculated form of psychological and physical torture designed to break the human spirit. If a person refused to enter a plea in a criminal trial, the law demanded a horrific response, progressive, crushing weight that would either force a plea or end in death. Margaret would become one of the few women in English history to endure this punishment. They laid her on the ground, her back pressed against the cold stone floor. A wooden board was placed across her body, a crude platform for what would follow. Then came The weights first iron then, progressively heavier stones each placed, methodically to increase the pressure. Each stone represented not just physical pain, but the overwhelming force of a state determined to crush religious. Dissent witnesses would later describe the excruciating process her ribs would crack first, then her internal organs will be slowly compressed. Every breath became a battle, every moment in testament to human endurance. But Margaret remained silent, her faith transforming physical agony into spiritual resistance. Behind the brutality lay a deeper narrative. This was not simply about punishing a woman, but about destroying a dangerous idea, the radical notion that one's personal faith could transcend state-mandated religion. Margaret's crime was not violence, but harboring Catholic priests and refusing to conform to Elizabeth's Protestant state. The stones kept coming. 15, 20, 30 pounds of crushing weight. Her breathing would become labored. Each inhale a struggle against the immense pressure, yet she did not cry out, did not beg, did not renounce her faith. In that moment, she turned an instrument of terror into a profound act of spiritual defiance. Local accounts suggest it took nearly 3 hours for Margaret to die, 3 hours of unimaginable suffering, witnessed by a crowd both horrified and mesmerized. Her last breaths were a silent sermon, more powerful than any spoken words. She transformed her execution from a moment of state sanctioned murder into a powerful statement of religious conviction. When the pressing was complete, Margaret's body was broken, but her spirit remained undefeated. She became more than a victim. She became a symbol. Catholic communities would remember her not as someone who was crushed, but as someone who chose dignity over submission, faith over survival. In those final moments pressed between wooden boards and crushing stones, Margaret Cleo did more than die. She wrote herself into history not as a passive victim, but as a woman who chose her beliefs with such profound courage that her silence would echo louder than any scream. Within a few generations of her death, Margaret Cleo transformed from a local Yorkshire woman into a powerful symbol of Catholic resistance. Her execution did not silence her faith, instead it amplified it, creating ripples of spiritual defiance that would echo through generations of religious persecution. The Catholic Church recognized her profound sacrifice quickly. In 1629, just decades after her brutal death, she was beatified by Pope Urban VI, her name inscribed among the honored martyrs who refused to compromise their beliefs. But Margaret was more than a religious icon. She was a testament to human courage in the face of systemic oppression. Her children carried her legacy forward. Her sons became Catholic priests, continuing the dangerous work of preserving their faith in a landscape designed to eradicate it. They understood that their mother's silence during her trial was not weakness, but a profound act of spiritual resistance. By refusing to please, she denied the court the performative spectacle of submission they craved. Historians would later describe her execution as a pivotal moment in the religious conflicts of Elizabeth and England. She wasn't just killed, she was made an example, a warning to other Catholics about the consequences of defiance. Yet paradoxically, each brutal punishment only strengthened the resolve of those who shared her faith. The stones that crushed her body became symbolic stones of foundation for a community's spiritual resilience. Margaret transformed her execution from a moment of state sanctioned terror into a powerful narrative of martyrdom. Her death was not just a personal tragedy, but a profound political statement about religious freedom and individual conviction. In York, her memory became more than a historical footnote. Local Catholics preserved stories of her courage, passing them through generations like sacred oral traditions. Children would hear about the woman who chose death over renouncing her beliefs. who protected priests at the risk of her own life, who saw her faith as something worth dying for. The Roman Catholic Church canonized her in 1970, recognizing her as a saint, a formal acknowledgement of the spiritual magnitude of her sacrifice. But her sainthood was more than a religious designation. It was a recognition of her extraordinary moral courage in a time when religious difference could mean the difference between life and death. Her legacy transcended religious boundaries. Margaret Clitheroe became a symbol of principled resistance, of refusing to bend to institutional power when that power demanded the sacrifice of one's deepest convictions. She demonstrated that true strength is not about survival, but about maintaining integrity in the face of overwhelming opposition. Centuries later, her story continues to resonate, a reminder that individual acts of courage can challenge systemic injustice. The woman pressed to death in a small Yorkshire cell became a beacon of resistance, her silence more powerful than any spoken defense, her faith more enduring than the stones that sought to silence her. In the quiet stones of York, in the whispers of Catholic families, passed down through generations, Margaret Clitheroe's story still breathes. Her execution was not merely a moment of personal tragedy, but a profound testament to the human spirit's capacity to resist oppression, to choose principle over survival. She was not just a martyr, but a complex woman who understood that her silence was itself a powerful form of resistance in a world where speaking could mean betrayal, where every word could unravel the hidden networks of Catholic priests and believers. Her refusal to plead became her most eloquent statement. The brutal method of her execution, pressed to death beneath heavy stones, was designed not just to kill, but to break her spirit, to make her an example. Yet in that medieval marketplace, as weights crushed her body, Margaret transformed a moment of state sanctioned terror into an act of transcendent defiance. Her last recorded words, "God be glorified," were not a cry of defeat, but a declaration of triumph. Her legacy rippled far beyond the immediate brutality of her death. In the underground Catholic communities of England, she became more than a person. She became a symbol of unwavering faith, of quiet courage that refuses to be silenced by institutional violence. Generations of Catholics would tell her story not as a narrative of victimhood, but as a powerful illustration of spiritual resilience. The Anglican authorities thought they were eliminating a threat. Instead, they created a martyr whose memory would outlive their own political machinations. Her canonization in 1970 by Pope Paul VI was not just a religious recognition, but a broader acknowledgement of her extraordinary moral courage. Margaret's story transcends religious boundaries. She represents something universal, the individual's right to hold private convictions in the face of state-mandated conformity. Her resistance was not loud or revolutionary in the traditional sense. It was deeply personal, rooted in an inner conviction that no external force could shake. In an era where religious persecution continues in various forms around the world, Margaret Clitheroe's story remains startlingly relevant. She reminds us that true courage is not about grand gestures, but about maintaining one's fundamental humanity when systems of power seek to crush it. Her life and death challenge us to consider what we would do when confronted with impossible choices. Would we compromise? Would we break? Or would we, like Margaret, find a strength that transforms personal suffering into a broader statement about human dignity? The stones that killed her could not silence her. In fact, they amplified her voice across centuries. In the cold calculation of her executioners, they saw a threat to be eliminated. In history's longer view, she emerges as something far more powerful, a beacon of moral courage, a reminder that the most profound Revolutions often begin in the quiet, unbreakable spirit of a single individual. Margaret Cleo did not just die that day in York, she became eternal.